Okay, so I've just overlocked those shoulders on the back and the front. So there's my front bodice there, and I'm just going to take my back bodice, or my back dress I should say, and place that right sides together on top. Match up those seams and clip them, and then I'm going to sew those together with a 1.5 cm seam allowance, or 5/8 of an inch. If you're not using an overlocker, then you can just zigzag those seams to neaten them. Just stops them from fraying. I think 3 clips would be right. You can use clips or pins. I just have my clips by my side, so I just use clips actually. Pins are just as good for this lightweight fabric. Once I've sewn these together, I will just press them open. Okay, make sure everything's sitting nice and flat. Match up your raw edges or your overlocked edges with the 15mm mark, and off we go. Oops, thread got caught underneath there. Just sewing with a nice straight seam, straight stitch, nothing fancy here. You'll notice a little bit of shaping at the end of this seam, just there. That's just so that when you fold it back to press up the sleeve hem, it will fit nicely and sit straight. So just follow that shaping round when you get to that point. Back stitch at the beginning and end. There you go. Same on the other side, and then press open. There we are, so those seams are now pressed open and flat. Now before we go on to actually fitting the facing in here, we're going to do some stay stitching, and I was wondering whether there was going to be a stay stitching instruction. It's quite unusual to have that instruction after doing the shoulder seams. Normally you're kind of asked to stay stitch right at the beginning of the project, at the same time as you kind of preparing all those interfacings. But anyway, we're being asked to stay stitch, so we'll do that now. Now what stay stitching is, if you look at this lovely V that you've got here at the front of your dress, this is cut almost across like the bias grain of the fabric. And what this means is that this will be liable to stretch. And stay stitching is a very short stitch length, and just inside from the raw edge, just in so within the seam allowance, it's not going to show. You're going to stitch from the front down to here, and then you're going to stitch from the shoulder down to the front again, with a short stitch length, and that will just bind together where you have cut across the diagonal grain of the fabric. It will bind together those fibres to stop them from wobbling out of place. So it is a really important stage. And then we're going to do the back again. Start at the shoulder, into the centre back, start at the other shoulder, come into the centre back. We don't want to go round in one swooping movement like this. We want to start here and come in here, and then start here and come in here. And the reason for that is that if, as you press it along, you might stretch. Can you see how that fabric is moving underneath my finger, creating that ripple? So it means that you'll end up with a slightly different shape on this side to this side, and you want them both to be the same. Same on the V-neck, exactly the same principle. So start at the shoulder, back to the centre back. Start on the other shoulder, back to the centre back. Start on the shoulder here, through to the centre front. Start on the shoulder here, through to the centre front. Straight stitch with a short stitch length within the seam allowance, and that will bind those fibres together that have been cut about, and it will stop your neckline from stretching as you apply your facing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just line up the edge, my raw edge, with the raw edge of the edge of the presser foot there. I want a nice short stitch length, like 1.5, and then I'm just gonna, I don't want it to stretch whilst it's going through, so I'm keeping the fabric that's going under, I'm keeping it slack. I'm not pulling it at all, because in pulling it I would actually defeat the object that we're trying to achieve, and I would actually stretch this fabric a bit. And this is just going to help then when we come to apply our facing. Like I say, normally I'd expect to see stay stitching instructions right at the beginning before we start fiddling about with making the garment, but so it's up to you. If you want to do your stay stitching very first thing, you can do. There you go. Can you see? Oops. There's the stay stitch there. Same on the other side, and then repeat the same around the back until all of the stay stitching is done. So there we go. It's all stay stitched round there. So we're going to cast that to one side. So the next thing we're going to do is prepare the facing. So take your back neck facing and put that facing you, right sides facing you, and then right sides together lay the front neck facing on top. Match up those shoulder seams on both sides, raw edges lining up and right sides together, and then we're just going to sew along those two with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance and then press them open. So the facing is done, sewn together at the shoulder seams, press those seams open. When you sew these shoulder seams, make sure that you do use a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, the same as what you do on your dress, because if you slightly stray away from that correct seam allowance, this measurement here will be different from the measurement on your dress, and you want this to fit nicely together. So just really pay attention to your seam allowances. I've just then gone and overlocked all the way round that edge there to neaten it off, and we are now ready to attach our facing to our dress. So I've got my dress in front of me. There's my neckline. You can see there's my shoulder seams either side. I'm looking at the right side of my dress, and then I'm going to take my facing and put that right sides together onto my neckline of my dress. Then we just need to pin around. So I'll start off by pinning the very obvious places. So the shoulder seam, we know that we want the facing and the dress to match up at the shoulder seam, so we can just put a couple of pins one either side. Then we have got this centre front V shape here, so we can put a pin in there, and then it's just simply a case of walking the fabric round, matching the raw edges and pinning at intervals. So it should just fit. You might find that your neckline on your dress has sort of stretched a tiny bit with all of the working around you've been doing. That stay stitching should help, but you just have to make sure to use a fair few pins to keep it all in place. That matches up nicely. Come around and do the same on the other side. It is a big old piece of fabric we're working with now, the back and front of this maxi dress all together. So just match up those raw edges. Absolutely cannot wait for this, to be able to wear this. I'm loving how it's coming together so far. There we go. Got a few pins in there. This is just matching up really nicely. And if yours isn't matching up, just check those shoulder seam allowances that they are the same, and it might be that you need to either let out or take in on your facing the shoulder seam allowance just to match it up. If you've been accurate with your seam allowances, you should just find that everything just sits nicely and matches up together all the way around. And if, you know, just using quite a few pins will help you as well. So once we've pinned all this together, lay it out so that you can see. Now that's nice and clear, isn't it? Let's tilt that camera. So there is my facing, whoops, wobbly camera stand, my facing pinned to my dress. Matched up at the shoulder seams, matched up at the centre front. Now what I want to do is I'm just going to sew all the way around that neckline, and the seam allowance is 1.5. So I'm just going to come all the way around. Now, one thing that you really need to be good with, you want to make sure, so you're going to come around the curve here, and you're going to come down here. Now when you come to this point here, you want to make sure that you pivot and come back up the other side at exactly the same point as where this centre front seam is. If you kind of overshoot it, and then let's use a pin, let's say that you're sewing down here and you overshoot that centre front seam, you carry on sewing and then you V back there and your point is there where you pivot your sewing, can you imagine that your V-neck isn't going to be, you're going to have your centre front seam but your V-neck's going to be off to the side? So we're going to sew all the way around. When we come here, we're going to make extra specially sure that we pivot right on that point. And actually one way that we can do this, if we grab a chalky pen, I can actually, let's take that pin out for just a sec. We can actually measure down 1.5 because it's a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Measure down 1.5 from that point. Put a little dot on it. Oops, didn't show up. And then poke up a pin from underneath, right on that, my pin underneath I'm putting right on that seam, and make it come through that dot there. So, you know, I know that I'm going to pivot there. You just want to make sure that where you pivot is exactly on that V-neck. So let's line that up again, put a couple of pins, one either side, to keep that together. And we'll then put a pin up through the seam at 1.5 down. So in fact it's probably better to measure 1.5 down there. And that's that point there at which we need to be pivoting. So just make sure that you pay extra special attention to that area when you come to sew it. And I hope that that will help you with your sewing, making it really accurate so that your V-neck is exactly hitting that centre front seam. So I've posted my dress under there, so here's my neck hole opening. I'm roughly at the centre back there, and I'm lining up my raw edges with the 1.5 cm line. Normal straight stitch, a couple of back stitches to begin with. And we're going to go round in one big swoop. You see my raw edges are matching up there. Make sure nothing's folding up or pleating underneath. You can see I'm going to have to come round this corner now. So I'll just take it nice and slow. Try to use a fairly small stitch length. That will help you travel round any curves because each stitch is shorter. Short stitches are easier when it comes to curves. I'm lifting up every few stitches, positioning, going again nice and slow. Take the pins out as I go. So I'm now coming back towards this, the point of my V-neck, and I just want to make sure, I'll take that pin out of the way for now, that I pivot right on that dot. Now when I'm on that dot, I'll just lift my foot up and I'll peep underneath and I'll just see, am I spot on that centre front seam? I'm actually about one stitch away. So I'll just hand wind one more stitch, lift it back up again, peep underneath and just have a look, and I am absolutely now bang on that centre front seam. So I'm happy now I can swivel round and start travelling back up in the other direction. And then you're just coming back up the other side of the neck, V-neck. And you're going to come back round and continue until you come back to where you started. So one thing that I like to do with these V-necks as well, once I've made sure that I'm happy with the position of that V, is I just trace my stitches and reinforce that V-neck with an additional line of stitching, because you're going to now be snipping into that V, and if you've just got an extra line of stitching, it just strengthens that point there. So I've now got double stitches and on that V. So there's your neckline that's now been stitched round. What we're going to do now is grade the seam allowances, and what that means is that I'm going to cut the facing down to about 3mm, and I'm going to cut the fabric side down to about 5mm, and it just reduces any bulk there. Okay, so I've got my little snips. Just be careful when you do this that you're only cutting what you mean to cut, and you're not cutting away any of your dress. That would be a shame after all this hard work, wouldn't it? So we're just trimming away. Doesn't have to be the neatest thing in the world, really. It's all going to get concealed, but this is just going to reduce the bulk around that seam area. There, so that's all now been trimmed down, and as you can see I've trimmed the fabric down a little less than I have the interfacing. Now again, using our scissors, we're going to carefully trim a line into our V so that when we turn it through we'll get a nice sharp point there. Be brave, but don't be too brave. Don't chop through your stitches. And then we just want to go through the curve at the back neck and just clip at intervals. Again, don't cut through your stitching, just trim towards the stitching and make sure you're only cutting the seam allowance. You're not kind of accidentally cutting your dress as well. So there's our neckline all trimmed. We can now turn it through. A moment of truth, turning it through to the right side, and hopefully you've got that lovely V point just at that seam there. Now we're going to do my favourite thing, which is understitching. And what we do with understitching is we put our fabric underneath our machine like this. Here's my facing, here's my dress. And we are going to sew a line of stitching all the way around that neckline, and we're going to sew our line of stitching about 3mm in from that seam along here. And when we're sewing along here, we are also sewing both of the layers of seam allowance. So you're basically pulling everything towards this side, using your fingers to sweep all of that seam allowance to the facing side, and you're basically stitching the facing to the seam allowance all the way round. And what that does is it just does a magic thing that basically makes that roll under, and it's going to give you a beautiful curve and a beautiful finish to your neckline, and it's going to help that facing roll to the inside. So once you've done that, then we can press it gently afterwards. But the first thing to do is that lovely understitching. So I'll just start my understitch at somewhere around the back neck there. So I'm just making sure that all of my seam allowance is pressed towards the facing, and make sure that everything's sitting flat. That what you don't want this facing to be curved over like that, and you don't want this dress to be curved over. You want everything to be sort of splayed out flat, and with all that seam allowance sitting underneath there. So just a couple of millimeters in from the edge, and again we're going to come round in one big circle. I can just see by looking through the little gap in my presser foot that my needle is there and my seam is there, so I'm just sewing a couple of millimeters in from that seam. So we're just coming around to that pesky point again, so just need to kind of sew to the point, and then we're going to pivot and come back in the other direction. Swivel all that fabric round to the other side. And then come back up again. And so there is the understitching, which has caught in all of the seam allowance, and that really does make it want to press to the inside. Got a lovely V point there right on the seam. And this is going to make it so much easier now. It wants to roll to the inside, and you've got that sort of ridge, that natural ridge there that it creates. So I love understitching. So what I'm going to do now is just give it a quick press, and our neckline is nearly done. And there's our beautifully finished neckline, which just has our facing on the inside. Lovely. I'm quite pleased with how that point is as well. So the next instruction is to top stitch all the way round. Now what we want to do is to do a top stitch 1 inch from the edge and just stitch all the way around there. I am thinking that, I don't know whether I just like it plain. I don't know whether putting a top stitch on there, I'm not sure actually whether I want that or not. So you have the choice really. In the instructions she says to do a top stitch, so all you would do is put a few pins to hold everything in place, carefully making sure that you kind of don't make pin marks on your beautiful neckline of your fabric, and then sort of sew all the way around 1 inch in. The alternative, which is just really to keep that facing in place, is just to stitch in the ditch, so sink stitch along your shoulder seam, attaching the facing in place on both of your shoulder seams and then on your centre front seam as well. And I don't think that the facing is going to pop out from that, and I just think it's going to give it a cleaner look. Having said that, for example, if I was making this in denim and just as a little casual kind of chuck on, like not a denim but like a chambray, I probably might like to do that top stitch to give it a feature, but because I've got quite a fabulous print here, I just don't know. I can't see that a top stitch is going to add anything, and it might kind of detract a little. So I'm actually just going to sink stitch and my shoulder seams and my centre front. But it's up to you. You can do whichever version you want, and really it'll be dictated to by whether you want that feature and which fabric you're using, whether you think it's going to suit it. So there's my shoulder seam there, and I'm just going to lift my presser foot onto the shoulder seam looking at the right side of the garment, and I'm just going to hand wind my needle, making sure that it just bonks into, good term there, just sinks into the seam, and those stitches will just kind of disappear into that very fine seam. You have to go a bit slow and be a bit careful with this. That's now nearly as a couple of stitches that came out. That is not going to show when I'm wearing it, but that's stitched that facing in place there. And I'm going to do that on the other shoulder seam, and I'm going to do that at the centre front as well, and that will keep that facing locked down. Alright, so that's done now at the centre front as well. And I just thought, if you don't like the idea of doing that sort of sink stitch into the seam, then the other way that you could stop the facing from popping down is just to do a hand stitch, attaching the seam allowance at the shoulder to the facing on either side, and then attaching the seam allowance at the centre front to the facing on either side, and that will just keep the facing from popping out. Yeah, if you want to do that top stitch you can, but I just think I prefer that cleaner look for my one.